This lesson is on the second explanation for forgetting in the memory topic, and it's called retrieval failure. So the specification says explanations for forgetting, retrieval failure due to absence of cues. And remember that when we're talking about explanations of forgetting, it's only in long-term memory that we're talking about. So we're going to look at the encoding specificity principle, context-dependent forgetting, and state-dependent forgetting. So retrieval failure talks about that you have forgotten something that's in your long-term memory because of an absence of cues. So a cue is a trigger of information that allows us to access a memory. And the reason that people forget is because there might not be enough cues in order for them to remember the information. And this is because when information is initially placed in memory, associated cues are stored at the same time. And if those cues are not available at the time of recall, it may make it appear as if you've forgotten the information, but in fact, it's just due to retrieval failure. It just means that you can't access the memory, but it's still there. And if you have the correct cue, then you will be able to recall it. So the encoding specificity principle is named on the specification. And when we talk about encoding, we're talking about how we need to think about how we code in memory. And you'll remember that we code acoustically for short-term memory and semantically for long-term memory. We can also encode visually. And what it means, coding means, it's the way that we kind of write information into our memories. So Tolving found a pattern of retrieval failure, which he called the encoding specificity principle. And it means that if a cue is to help us recall information, it has to be present at encoding when we learn the material and at retrieval when we recall it. And if the cues are not available at retrieval, we might experience some forgetting. So coding means how we write the information into memory. So if we encode the information visually, that means that as we are experiencing something that we're going to remember, so supposing you were, I don't know, in Spa and you saw somebody shoplift something, hopefully not, but if you did see that, at the same time as creating that memory of somebody shoplifting something, you will also automatically be visually encoding all of the information around you. And so those visual things that you are looking at have been learned at the same time as making the memory. So the encoding specificity principle says those two things are now linked in your memory because you have created a new memory of somebody shoplifting, and at the same time you've encoded all of the visual information around you and maybe the auditory, like the acoustic information as well. And so those things have been learnt at the same time and they act as cues. So if you don't have those visual cues at the time of recall, you might forget the details of what you have seen. So context-dependent forgetting is also named on the spec. And as I just said, when you learn something, when you create a memory, you are also visually encoding all of the information around you, the contextual information of where you actually are. Now I've put a picture of a whole raw chicken there because when I create lessons, I quite often try and create little weird pictures and stuff that will act as a cue. Like once you think of the raw chicken, it will act as a visual cue to remind you of information that you learned at the time. So when you see the whole raw chicken, it should trigger some memories about a study in a hairdresser's where participants saw a thief enter a hairdressing salon and they were holding one of 4 items, one of which was a whole raw chicken. And so that whole raw chicken should like remind you, be a cue for all of those other details of that experiment. So I purposefully give you visual cues, and when we think about context-dependent forgetting, sometimes cues are encoded at the time of learning, but not in a meaningful way. So I will give you visual cues, but every time you are creating a new memory, you are also encoding the contextual information around you, the visual things that you can see, the things that you can hear, the things you can smell, all of those things are being encoded at the same time. So we're going to look at those things, context-dependent forgetting, and we're also going to look at state-dependent forgetting. But context-dependent forgetting is about the external cues. So it says here, have you ever walked into a room and forgotten why you went there? And then you go back to your original room and remember the reason. You're in the same context as when you first thought of what you wanted from the other room, and so you recall it. So this is saying the context in which we learn something will help us remember. Context-dependent cues are external cues that are encoded at the time of learning, but we don't necessarily pay attention to them. They are just there. So that example I talked about, if you were in Spa and saw someone shoplifting, at the time of creating that memory, you have also encoded all of the visual information, all the things on the shelves, the person who is serving you maybe, the conversations that people are having. Those external cues will act as triggers for the information, but if those cues are not available at the time of recall, then you might experience the forgetting. So the key study for context-dependent forgetting is called the Scuba diver study, and scuba divers learned a list of words either underwater or on land, and then they were asked to recall the words either underwater or on land, which created 4 conditions of the independent variable, which you can see there. Learn on land, recall on land, learn on land, recall underwater, learn underwater, recall on land, or learn underwater, recall underwater. So the findings were that in the 2 conditions where the context was different when you were trying to recall, was that those people had 40% lower recall than the people who were in the same context at learning and retrieval, which is a great study to show that the visual cues of being underwater or on land would have triggered more memories. You can pause the video here and answer these research methods questions, just a bit of research methods practice, and also to think a bit more deeply about the scuba diver study. So context-dependent forgetting was about external cues in the environment. State-dependent forgetting refers to internal cues. So the mental state that you are in at the time of learning can also act as a cue. It's an internal cue called state-dependent forgetting. So whatever mental state you learn something in, you remember it best, again, if you recall it in the same mental state. And if you've got the copy of the Complete Companion 4th or 5th edition with the cat on the front for psychology, then have a look at page 54 and you can read about the study that Godden did. Very briefly, it was just that they gave participants, they gave half the participants alcohol to make them drunk, and they were given 3 times the legal drink driving limit, and asked them to learn a list of words. So the findings were that if you learnt the list sober, you recalled them best sober, and if you learnt the list drunk, then you recalled them best drunk. So the internal mental state that you were in this case being drunk, acts as a cue. So I'd like you to have a go at this apply your knowledge question. It's an AO2, and it says, Paul drove his friends out to eat one summer's day. Just as they got to the restaurant car park, he suddenly realised something. He had forgotten his wallet. I keep my wallet and jacket in different places, but always pick them up together, Paul said. But because it's such a lovely evening, I decided not to bother with the jacket. So the question, that's your stimulus, the question is, can you explain how Paul deciding not to wear his jacket meant he forgot his wallet? And pause the video there and write that, just 1 paragraph as a 2 marker to explain. So you're going to be thinking either about context or state-dependent forgetting for that question. Then have a go at this exam style question, another AO2. Harry enjoyed his German GCSE, but it wasn't until a couple of years later that he actually met any German people. He met Helga and Klaus in a pub and spent all evening drinking beer with them, while they helped him practice his German, where he became very fluent. Using the retrieval failure explanation of forgetting, explain why Harry couldn't speak German the next day, but could speak it brilliantly when you met Helga and Klaus drinking beer in the pub the next weekend. 4 marks. So in this question, it says, why couldn't he speak German the next day and why could he speak it again? And you need to really, there's several ways or a few ways you can answer this question, but probably the best way to do it is to have 1 paragraph about state-dependent forgetting and 1 paragraph about context-dependent forgetting, and make sure that you really focus the answer on forgetting, because it gets very easy to say, oh, he'll remember this much better in this environment, but say why he forgot the information, because the whole part of this spec is on forgetting. So in class we did some small group work. So small groups took one of the following evaluation points and then created a beautiful A4 poster They identified if the evaluation point was a strength or a criticism of the theory, and they included images to help them make the point. So the reason that they included images was to create those contextual cues that would act as a visual. So when you think of the poster and there'll be a really interesting visual image on there, it will remind you then of the details of the evaluation point. So the evaluation points are coming up, and I really recommend that if you weren't in the lesson, that you just take time to look at each one, identify if it's a strength or a weakness, and you don't necessarily have to explain it in your own words, but you might want to add a bit more detail or give an example. So this was the first one. So just pause the video so you can fully read this and take this in. Check MS Teams for any directed study, and yeah, it's probably best to do the exam style questions that are in the textbook. And then if you're in year 2, you can write a 16 marker, or if you're in year 1, then a 12 marker, and that's where you outline and evaluate the whole theory.